Okay, so the 60s, 8-tracks came along, developed for auto use. This is like museum pieces now. But it was a cartridge, and you'd pop it into your car player, and you could hit a button, it would jump from one track to the next, and you had 8 tracks that you could choose from. I never liked it too much, but it was like an endless loop of tape, so it would play over and over and over, and you could choose different songs each time. But it was introduced in 1965 by Ford in their cars. The cassettes actually predated the 8-track, but it was a cheap technology. Cassettes were created as a very inexpensive technology that was made for kids to play around with their games, and they could toss them away. It was developed by Philips in 1962, and they had a royalty on every cassette that was sold. So whether it was a cassette made by Columbia or Epic or any record label, Philips Corporation had a royalty on every cassette made and sold. Ray Dolby adapted Hiss Reduction in 1968 for cassettes. The movie industry and the audio industry were becoming very interconnected, and they still are to this date. Record sales went from 66 million in 1960 to 1.2 billion in 1970. So you can see the industry was really, really growing. Cassettes took over 8 tracks in the mid-70s, and took over LPs in the early 80s. So more cassettes were being sold than LPs in the early 80s, spawned boom boxes. In 1978, the first Walkman was introduced. The Walkman, that first idea of having something totally portable, eventually, obviously, you know where it developed. But that was the first time it was ever really thought of to make something that people could carry around and listen to their own personal music, right, on headphones. CD introduced in 1982 by Philips and Sony based on Laserdisc technology. The CD Walkman in the mid-80s became popular format in the 90s, and the DAT in 1990. I remember when that came around, I got one because one of my bands that I was working with and recording went to Japan on tour and came back with this thing. It was a DAT machine. I'm like, what is this? It was from Sony. And it took these little micro mini DV cassettes that was digital tape, and you could pop it in and record digitally in stereo. So that was like a huge breakthrough for digital technology. And here's a really great slide. Sort of puts it all into perspective a little bit. From 1982, the Sony 3324. It was a digital tape machine that was built after a 24-track analog tape machine. And 3324 meant 24 tracks, and it was a digital tape machine that was like maybe the size of a clothes dryer. It was huge, and you'd put a half-inch digital tape on it, and it would record 24 tracks in digital. So it was kind of like a DAT player, except it wasn't on a cassette, it was on a reel-to-reel tape, and you could record 24 channels. That machine, just to give you some perspective, would sell for like $105,000 to $110,000. To have a professional recording studio cost way over $1 million just in equipment. Then Sony, after that, made a 3348, which was 48 channels of digital recording, and that one sold for like $225,000. One of the producers that I worked with as a young engineer had 2 of those machines in road cases. That gives you a perspective. That's 1982. For 48 channels of digital recording, of course, I've got more than 48 channels on my laptop here now. In 1984, Sound Designer was actually developed. Sound Designer was the forerunner to Pro Tools. It was the first stereo digital recording on a computer, and they developed a technology for the sound files called Sound Designer Sound Files. And up until Pro Tools 7.2, I believe that they allowed you to still use Sound Designer 2, which was the second version of Sound Designer Sound Files, and it was proprietary to Pro Tools. That's before Pro Tools got bought by Avid. I know this is probably Greek to most of you, but you see this whole thing is developing and developing. It's not terribly important that you know any of these details. It's just interesting for me to relive my past. Anyway, Sound Tools was the next development in 1989, and we used to use it to mix to because you could undo edits in your computer just automatically. You could say undo and it would undo it. It was really amazing because up until then we'd record in stereo on tape, and if you wanted to edit something, you'd have to actually take a razor, slice it, and then move it around, and then tape the tape back together. It was a very durable medium, but it took a lot of time. And I remember back in the day when I was editing a record, you'd have pieces of, oh, that's the verse hanging over there, and that's the chorus sitting over there. And if you got them backwards, then you have to undo it and redo it again. And actually, that was sort of a technique of music production. One of the bands that I worked with, they made some self-made recordings, and they could only afford one reel of tape because they were a really broke band. And 24-track tape back then was like $225 a reel for 15 minutes of recording. So what they would do is they'd take and do 1 minute of the drum machine on one of the 24 tracks, and then they would do the verse information on the next 8 tracks, and then the chorus information on the next 8 tracks, and sort of break it up so it wasn't a linear process. It was more like we're going to use all these tracks differently. And then when I mixed it, I'd have to go mix the verse on a piece of 1/2-inch 2-track tape, and then stop, mix the chorus, all in different pieces. And then I'd lay them out on the wall. We'd tape them up on the wall with the beginning starting at the top of the wall and all the tape hanging down. And then they'd come in and go, okay, we want a double verse, and then we want a single chorus, and then a double chorus at the end. So I'd go, okay. And I'd start taping these things together in that order. And it actually worked really well. But with sound tools, you could actually record and then copy, paste, undo. It was like, wow, this is great. No more razor blades, no more tape. It was great. And it was fast. And you could do different versions and then make a cassette, send the artist home with that, and then they'd say, oh, I think I like this version better than that version. So you could start editing masters and creating music in a different way. So using the studio more as a creative tool. So you notice that as technology improves, the creative part of making music starts getting into the actual studio technology and how the engineers became creative to help the musician create music how they wanted to hear it. Then in 1991, Alesis developed the ADAT, and basically it would record 8 channels of digital audio, and you could get multiple machines, and they would loop them together, and then you cross your fingers and hope that they synchronized. But the concept was a good idea, where you could cut and paste, sing one chorus, and then time shift it and put it into the music of the second chorus and the third chorus. And so it's basically like sampling and cutting and pasting that you can do now in your DAW digital workstations. And then Pro Tools. First, Pro Tools was 4-track. It was called Pro Tools in 1991. Then the D88 came along in 1993, which was basically a glorified ADAT, except it was on smaller cassettes, and it was a much more stable environment. And most films used the D88s to mix from. So when you're making a film, there's so many different tracks of audio that have to be combined to make your film. It's not just dialogue, it's not just music, which is multiple tracks as well. It's sound effects, it's Foley. Foley is, when they make the sound of you walking, those sounds. All of these different sounds. So when you're mixing a film, there's so many audio tracks that when we used to use tape or mag machines, you'd get this tape hiss coming up and sort of being distracting. It was a real problem making sure that the noise was quiet enough so it wasn't becoming a part of people noticing it. But the digital recording, the D88, had very, very low noise floor, if none. And so you could record hundreds of tracks without having an appreciable noise floor. And so it was really important for films where they could lock up 20 D88s with 8 tracks each and mix with them. Pro Tools 3 in 1994, it was 16 tracks, and you'd put cards inside the computer to do the work, and it was amazing. It would sample at 44.1 sample rate and 16-bit bit depth, which was actually what a CD was. So basically there was a pro machine, and it was 16 channels. Only 16 channels, that's it. I remember doing background vocals, 8 tracks, and having to combine them to 2 tracks and then erasing the original so I had more tracks to work with. And it was, in a sense, sort of an old-fashioned reduction mix where you'd have to commit to a blend of sound elements every step of the way because you'd run out of tracks so quick if you wanted to stay in the digital environment. And then in 2002, Pro Tools HD. So that's an HD3 system could yield 128 channels of recording. Essentially, on your laptop now, you've got more power then actually on my phone, my GarageBand on my phone has probably as much power as I had when I first started working on digital recording in the early 90s.